Chapter 21. Such then were our relations when that man appeared. He came to Moscow. His name was Trukachevsky, and he came to my house. It was in the morning I received him. In former times we had been on familiar terms. He endeavoured, sometimes using the more formal, sometimes the more familiar form of address, to keep on his old footing of thee and thou. But I quickly settled the question by using the formal you, and he immediately took the hint. Even at the first glance he impressed me unfavourably, but strangely enough some peculiar fatal power impelled me not to keep him at a distance, to send him away, but rather to draw him nearer to me. Why, what could have been simpler than to have talked coolly with him a few minutes, and to have said, "Good morning," without introducing him to my wife? But no, I talked with him deliberately about his playing, and remarked that we had been told that he had given up playing the fiddle. He replied that, on the contrary, he was playing now more than ever before. He recalled the fact that I, too, had once played. I said that I had given up playing, but that my wife played very well. Wonderful thing! My relations to him that very first day, that very first hour of my meeting with him, were such as they could have been only after all that occurred subsequently. There was something strained in my relations with him. I noticed every word, every expression said by him or myself, and attributed importance to them. I presented him to my wife. Immediately a conversation on music began between them, and he offered his services to practice with her. My wife, as was always the case with her at that later period of her life, was very elegant and fascinating, captivatingly beautiful. He evidently pleased her at first sight. Moreover, she was delighted with the prospect of having the gratification of playing with violin and piano, which she liked so much that she had once hired a fiddler from the theatre, and her face expressed this pleasure. But as soon as she saw me, she instantly understood how I felt about it, and her expression changed, and our game of mutual deceit began. I smiled pleasantly, pretending it was very agreeable to me. He, looking at my wife, as all immoral men look at pretty women, pretended that he was interested in nothing else but the topic of conversation, especially that part which did not interest him at all. She tried to seem indifferent, but my falsely smiling expression of jealousy, so well known to her, and his lecherous look, evidently disturbed her. I saw that from his very first glance her eyes shone with peculiar brilliancy, and apparently, as a consequence of my jealousy, there passed between him and her something like an electrical shock, calling forth something like a uniformity in the expression of their eyes and their smiles. She blushed, he reddened. She smiled, he smiled. They talked about music, about Paris, about all sorts of trifles. He rose to take his leave, and stood smiling with his hat resting against his quivering thigh, and looked now at her, now at me, apparently waiting to see what we would do. I remember that moment especially, because at that moment I might have refrained from inviting him to call again, and if I had, the trouble would not have happened. But I looked at him and her. "Do not think for an instant that I am jealous of you," said I, mentally to her, "or that I am afraid of you," said I, mentally to him. And I invited him to come some evening and bring his fiddle and play with my wife. She looked at me in surprise, blushed, and as if startled, began to plead off, declaring that she did not play well enough. This refusal of hers irritated me still more, and I insisted on it with all the more vehemence. I remember the strange feeling I had as I looked at the back of his head and his white neck, strongly contrasting with his black hair, which was combed back on both sides, as he left us with a springy gait like that of a bird. I cannot help acknowledging to myself that this man's presence was a torture to me. It depends on me, I said to myself, to act in such a way as never to see him again. But so to act would be equivalent to a confession that I fear him. No, I do not fear him. It would be too humiliating. I said to myself. And there in the anteroom, knowing that my wife was listening to me, I insisted that he should come back that very evening and bring his fiddle with him. He promised that he would, and took his departure. In the evening he came with his fiddle, and they played together. But for a long time the music did not go very well. We had not the pieces that he wanted, and those he had my wife could not play without preparation. I was very fond of music, and sympathized with their playing, arranging the music stand for him and turning over the leaves. They managed to play something, a few songs without words, and a sonata by Mozart. He played excellently, and he had, to the highest degree, what is called temperament. Moreover, a delicate, noble art, entirely out of keeping with his character. He was, of course, far stronger than my wife, and he helped her, and at the same time politely praised her playing. He behaved very well. My wife seemed interested only in the music, and was very simple and natural. Although I also pretended to be interested in the music, still all the evening I did not cease to be tortured by jealousy. From the first moment when his eyes fell on my wife, I saw that the wild beast existing in them both, out of the reach of all the conditions of their position and the society in which they lived, was asking, "Is it possible?" and answering its own question with a "Yes, certainly it is." I saw that he had never expected to find in my wife, in a society lady of Moscow, such a fascinating creature, and that he was delighted. Therefore there could be no doubt in his mind that she was harmonious with him. The whole question consisted in how the insufferable husband should not interfere with them. If I myself had been pure, I should not have understood this. But I, like the majority of men, had indulged in the same notions of women until I was married, and therefore I could read his soul like a book. I was especially tormented by the fact that I could remark that her feelings and mine were in a state of constant irritation, only occasionally interrupted by our habitual sensuality, while this man, both by his external elegance and by his novelty, by the fact that he was a stranger, but chiefly because of his indubitably great musical talent, by the proximity due to their playing together, by the influence produced by music, especially by a fiddle, on a very impressionable nature. All this, I say, made it inevitable that this man should please her, and more than that he should get a complete ascendancy over her, without the least hesitation, conquer, overwhelm, fascinate, enchain, and do with her whatever he willed. I could not help seeing that, and I suffered awfully. But, in spite of this, or possibly in consequence of it, some force against my will compelled me to be especially polite and even affectionate to him. Whether I did this to show my wife, to show him that I was not afraid of it, or whether I did it to deceive myself, I do not know. Only I could not, from the very first, be natural with him. In order not to yield to my desire to kill him on the spot, I had to be friendly toward him. At dinner I treated him to expensive wines. I praised him for his playing, and talked with him with a peculiarly affectionate smile, and invited him to dinner on the following Sunday, and to play again with my wife. I said I would ask some of my musical friends to hear him, and so it came to an end. And poor Zdenirchev, under the influence of powerful emotion, changed his position, and emitted his peculiar sounds. "It is strange what an effect the presence of that man had on me," he began once more, evidently making an effort to become calm. 2 or 3 days after this, I came home from an exhibition, and as I entered the vestibule, I became conscious of a sudden feeling of oppression, exactly as if a stone had rolled on my heart, and I could not explain it to myself. It was due to the fact that as I was passing through the vestibule, I noticed something which reminded me of him. Only when I reached my library was I able to explain what it was, and I returned to the vestibule to verify it. Yes, I had not been mistaken. It was his cloak, a fashionable cloak, you know, everything relating to him, although I could not explain the why and wherefore, I remarked with extraordinary attention. I asked if he was there, and the servant said yes. I passed through the recitation room, not the drawing room, into the hall. Eliza, my daughter, was sitting with her book, and the nurse with the little girl was sitting at the table spinning a cover. The door into the hall was closed, but I could hear the monotonous arpeggios and the sound of her voice and his. I listened, but could not decide what to do. Evidently the notes of the piano were played on purpose to drown out their words, perhaps their kisses. My God, what a storm arose in me! The mere thought of the wild beast which then awoke in me fills me with horror. My heart suddenly contracted, then stopped beating, and it began to throb like a sledgehammer. The chief feeling, as always in any outburst of anger, was pity for myself. Before the children, before the nurse, I exclaimed inwardly. I must have been terrible to look at, because even Lisa looked at me with frightened eyes. What is there for me to do? I asked myself. Shall I go in? Oh, I cannot, for God knows what I should do. But neither can I go away. The nurse is looking at me as if she understood my position. But I cannot go in. I said this to myself, and hurriedly opened the door. He was sitting at the piano, and was playing those arpeggios with his large white fingers bent back. She was standing at one corner of the grand, bending over an open score. She was the first to see me or hear me, and she looked at me. I know not whether she was startled, or pretended not to be startled, or really was not startled. At any rate, she did not show any agitation, or even move, but merely blushed, but that was afterward. How glad I am that you have come. We can't decide what to play next Sunday, said she, in a tone which she would never have employed in addressing me when we were alone. That and the fact that she said we, connecting herself and him, exasperated me. I silently bowed to him. He pressed my hand, and instantly, with a smile which seemed to me derisive, began to explain that he had brought some music for Sunday, but that they could not agree what to play. Whether something difficult and classical, such as a Beethoven violin sonata, or some easy trifles. All this was so natural and simple that it was impossible to find any fault with it, and yet I was convinced that it was all a falsehood, that they had been planning how to deceive me. One of the most torturing conditions for jealous men, and all of us are jealous in our fashionable society, are certain social conventions whereby the greatest and most dangerous proximity is permitted to a man and a woman. People would simply make themselves ridiculous if they tried to prevent this proximity, at balls, between doctors and their female patients, between artists and especially musicians. Two people occupy themselves with the noblest of arts, music. In order to accomplish this, a certain proximity is required, and this proximity has nothing reprehensible in it, and only a stupid, jealous husband could find anything undesirable in it. But meantime, all know that precisely by means of these very occupations, especially by music, the largest part of the adultery committed in the ranks of our society is committed. I especially confused them by the confusion which I myself showed. It was long before I could speak a word. I was like an upturned bottle from which the water will not flow because it is too full. I wanted to heap abuses on him, to drive him away, but I felt that it was my duty to be friendly and affectionate to him again, and so I was. I pretended that I approved of everything, and once more I felt that strange impulse which compelled me to treat him with a friendliness proportioned to the torment which his presence caused me. I told him that I had great confidence in his taste, and I advised her to do the same. He stayed just as long as it was required to do away with the disagreeable impression made by my sudden appearance with such a scared face, and after a silence he took his departure, pretending that they had now determined what they would play the next day. I was perfectly convinced that in comparison with what was really occupying them, the question as to what they should play was perfectly immaterial. I accompanied him with more than ordinary courtesy to the vestibule. How could one fail to treat courteously a man who had come on purpose to disturb my peace of mind and destroy the happiness of a whole family? And I pressed his soft white hand with a special affection. Chapter 22. That whole day I did not speak to her. I could not. Her proximity produced in me such hatred of her that I feared for myself. At dinner she asked me in the presence of the children when I was going away. My duties called me the following week to a meeting in my district. I told her when. She asked me if I needed anything for my journey. I did not say anything, and I sat in silence at the table and silently went to my library. Of late she had got out of the habit of coming to my library, especially at that time of day. I was lying down in my library and was angry enough. Suddenly her well-known steps were heard coming, and the terrible ugly thought leaped to my brain that she, like Uriah's wife, had already committed the sin and wanted to hide it, and that was why she was coming to me at such an unseasonable hour. Can it be that she is really coming to me? I asked myself as I heard her approaching step. If she is coming to me, then it means I'm right. And in my soul arose an ineffable hatred of her. Nearer and nearer came her steps. Can it be that she's going by into the hall? No. The door creaked, and her tall, handsome figure appeared, and her face, her eyes expressed timidity and a desire to win my goodwill, as I could easily see, and the significance of it I understood perfectly. I almost suffocated, so long I held my breath, and continuing to stare at her, I grasped my cigarette case and began to smoke. Now, how can you? Someone comes to sit with you, and you go to smoking. And she sat down near me on the divan and leaned up against me. I moved away so as not to be in contact with her. I see that you are vexed because I'm going to play on Sunday, said she. Not in the least, said I. But can't I see that you are? Well, I congratulate you on your perspicacity. I see nothing except the fact that you behave like a coquette. To you all such kinds of vulgarity are pleasant, but to me they are horrible. There now, if you're going to abuse me like a cab driver, then I will go. Go then. But know that the honour of your family is not dear to you. Neither are you dear to me. The devil take you. But the honour of the family is. Now what do you mean? Get out of my sight. For God's sake, get out. I know not whether she pretended that she did not comprehend, or really did not comprehend. But she only took offence, grew angry, and instead of leaving, stood in the middle of the room. You have become positively unendurable, she began. You have such a disposition that not even an angel could get along with you. And as always, trying to wound me as keenly as possible, she reminded me of the way I had treated my sister. It had happened that one time I forgot myself and spoke some very harsh words to my sister. She knew about it, and that it tormented me, and so she wounded me in that place. After that, nothing that you could do would surprise me, said she. Yes, insult me, humiliate me, disgrace me, make me out to blame, said I to myself. And suddenly a terrible anger against her seized me, such as I had never before experienced. For the first time I felt the impulse to express this anger with physical force. I leapt up and moved towards her. But at the instant that I sprang to my feet, I became conscious of my anger, and asked myself, is it well to give way to this impulse? And immediately the answer came that it was, that this would serve to frighten her. And on the spot, instead of withstanding my wrath, I began to fan it to a greater heat, and to rejoice because it grew more and more intense in me. "Get out of here, or I will kill you!" I screamed, going closer to her and seizing her by the arm. In saying this, I was conscious of raising my voice to a higher pitch, and I must have become terrible, because she became so frightened that she had not the strength to go, but merely stammered, "Vasha, what is it? What is the matter with you?" "Go!" I cried, in still louder tone. "No one but you can drive me to madness. I won't be responsible for what I may do." Having given free course to my madness, I intoxicated myself with it, and I felt the impulse to do something extraordinary which should show the high water-mark of this madness of mine. I felt a terrible impulse to strike her, to kill her. But I knew that it was an impossibility, and therefore, in order to give free course to my madness, I snatched up a paperweight from the table, and shouting once more, "Go!" I flung it down on the floor, near her. I aimed it carefully, so as to strike near her. Then she left the room, but remained standing in the doorway, And then, while she was still looking, I did it so that she might see. I began to snatch up from the table various objects, the candlestick, the inkstand, and hurled them on the floor, still continuing to shout, "Go, get out of my sight! I won't be responsible for what I may do." She went, and I immediately ceased. In the course of an hour, the nurse came and told me that my wife was suffering from hysterics. I went to her. She was sobbing and laughing, and could not speak a word, and was trembling all over. She was not pretending, but was really ill. Toward morning she grew calm, and we had a reconciliation under the influence of that passion which we call love. In the morning after our reconciliation, I confessed to her that I was jealous of Kreutzer. She was not in the least confused, and laughed in the most natural manner. So strange even to her seemed, as she said, the possibility of being drawn to such a man. Is it possible that a respectable woman could feel anything for such a man beyond the pleasure which his music might afford? But if you wish, I am ready not to see him again. Even though all the guests are invited for Sunday, write him that I am ill, and that will be the end of it. Only one thing makes me indignant, and that is that anyone could imagine, and especially he himself, that he is dangerous. I am too proud to permit myself to think of such a thing. And evidently she was not prevaricating. She believed in what she was saying. She hoped by these words to evoke in herself scorn for him, and to defend herself from him. But she did not succeed in this. Everything went against her, especially that cursed music. Thus the episode ended, and on Sunday the guests gathered, and they played together again. Chapter 23. I think it is superfluous to remark that I was very ostentatious. There would not be any living in our general society if it were not for ostentation. Thus on that Sunday I took the greatest pains to arrange for our dinner and for the evening musicale. I myself ordered the things for dinner, and invited the guests. At 6 o'clock the guests had arrived, and he also, in evening dress with diamond shirt-studs of bad taste. He was free and easy, made haste to answer all questions with a smile of sympathy and appreciation. You know what I mean, with that peculiar expression that signifies that everything you say or do is exactly what he expected. I remark now, with especial satisfaction, everything about him calculated to give an unfavourable impression, because all this served to calm me, and prove that he stood in my wife's eyes on such a low level that, as she said, she could not possibly descend to it. I did not allow myself to be jealous. In the first place, I had already been through the pangs of that torment, and needed rest. In the second place, I wanted to have faith in my wife's asseverations, and I did believe in them. But in spite of the fact that I was not jealous, still I was not at my ease with either of them, and during the dinner and the first half of the evening before the music began, I kept watching their motions and glances all the time. The dinner was like any dinner, dull and conventional. The music began rather early. Oh, how well I remember all the details of that evening. I remember how he brought his fiddle, opened the case, took off the covering which had been embroidered for him by some lady, took out the instrument and began to tune it. I remember how my wife sat with a pretendedly indifferent face, under which I saw that she was hiding great diffidence, the diffidence caused chiefly by distrust of her own ability. How she took her seat at the grand piano with the same affected look, and struck the usual A, which was followed by the pizzicato of the fiddle, and the getting into tune. I remember how, then, they looked at each other, glanced at the audience, and then made some remark, and the music began. He struck the first chords. His face grew grave, stern, and sympathetic, and as he bent his head to listen to the sounds he produced, he placed his fingers cautiously on the strings. The piano replied, and it began. Postoniachev paused, and several times emitted his peculiar sounds. He started to speak again, but snuffed through his nose, and again paused. They played Beethoven's Kreutzer sonata. he finally went on to say. "Do you know the first presto? You know it?" he cried. Oh, that sonata is a terrible thing, and especially that movement. The music in general is a terrible thing. I cannot comprehend it. What is music? What does it do? And why does it have the effect it has? They say music has the effect of elevating the soul. Rubbish! Falsehood! It has its effect. It has a terrible effect. I am speaking about its effect on me, but not at all by elevating the soul. Its effect is neither to elevate nor to degrade, but to excite. How can I explain it to you? Music makes me forget myself, my actual position. It transports me into another state, not my natural one. Under the influence of music, it seems to me that I feel what I do not really feel, that I understand what I do not really understand, that I can do what I can't do. I explain this by the fact that music acts like yawning or laughing. I am not sleepy, but I yawn looking at anyone else who is yawning. I have nothing to laugh at, but I laugh when I hear others laugh. Music instantaneously transports me into that mental condition in which he who composed it found himself. I blend my soul with his, and together with him am transported from one mood to another. But why this is so, I cannot tell. For instance, he who composed the Kreutzer sonata, Beethoven, he knew why he was in that mood. That mood impelled him to do certain things, and therefore that mood meant something for him, but it means nothing for me. And that is why music excites and does not bring to any conclusion. Now they play a military march. The soldiers move forward under its strains, and the music accomplishes something. They play dance music, and I dance, and the music accomplishes something. They perform a mass, I take the sacrament. Again, the music accomplishes its purpose. But in other cases, there is only excitement, and it is impossible to tell what to do in this state of mind. And that is why music is so terrible, why it sometimes has such an awful effect. In China, music is regulated by government, and this is as it should be. Is it permissible that anyone whatever shall hypnotize another person or many persons and then do with them what he pleases? And especially if this hypnotizer happens to be the first immoral man that comes along. And indeed, it is a terrible means to place in anyone's hands. For example, how could anyone play this Kreutzer sonata, the first presto, in a drawing-room before ladies dressed décolleté? To play that presto, and then to applaud it, and then to eat ices and talk over the last bit of scandal. These things should be played only in certain grave, significant conditions, and only then when certain deeds corresponding to such music are to be accomplished. First play the music, and perform that which this music was composed for. But to call forth an energy which is not consonant with the place or the time, and an impulse which does not manifest itself in anything, cannot fail to have a baneful effect. On me, at least, it had a horrible effect. It seemed to me that entirely new impulses, new possibilities were revealed to me in myself, such as I had never dreamed of before. This is the way I should live and think, not at all as I have lived and thought hitherto, seemed to be whispered into my soul. What this new thing was, I now knew I could not explain, even to myself, but the consciousness of this new state of mind was very delightful. All those faces, his and my wife's among them, presented themselves in a new light. After the Allegro, they played the beautiful but rather commonplace and far from original Andante, with the cheap variations and the weak finale. Then, at the request of the guests, they played other things. First an elegy by Ernst, and then various other trifles. All this was very good, but it did not produce on me 100th part of the impression which the first did. But all the music had the same background as the impression which the first produced. I felt gay and happy all the evening. I never saw my wife look as she did that evening, her gleaming eyes, her gravity and serenity of expression while she was playing, her perfectly melting mood, her tender, pathetic and blissful smile after they had finished playing. I saw it all, but attributed to it no significance other than that she was experiencing the same thing as I was, that before her, as before me, new and hitherto unexampled feelings were revealed, dimly arising in her consciousness. The evening was pronounced a great success, and when it was over, the guests took their departure. Knowing that I was going to the district meeting in 2 days, Trukhachevsky, on bidding me farewell, said that he hoped that when he next came to Moscow he should have another pleasant evening like that. From this remark I was able to conclude that he did not deem it possible to visit my house during my absence, and that was agreeable to me. It seemed clear that as I should not return before his departure, we should not meet again. For the first time, I shook hands with him with genuine pleasure, and thanked him for the gratification he had afforded us. He also bade my wife a final farewell, and their final farewell seemed to me most natural and proper. Everything was admirable. Both my wife and I were very well satisfied with the evening. Chapter 24. 2 days later, I started for my district, taking leave of my wife in the happiest and calmest frame of mind. In the district there was always a pile of work and a special life, a special little world. For 2 days I worked 10 hours a day in my office. On the 3rd day a letter from my wife was brought to me in the office. I read it then and there. She wrote about the children, about her uncle, about the nurse girl, about the things she had bought, and mentioned as something perfectly commonplace the fact that Trukhachevsky had been to call, and had brought the music he had promised, and that he had offered to come and play again, but that she had declined. I did not remember that he had promised to bring any music. I had supposed that he had taken his final leave at that time, and so this gave me an unpleasant surprise. But I was so deeply engrossed in business that I could not stop to think it over, and it was not until evening, when I returned to my room, that I reread her letter. Besides the fact that Trukhachevsky had called again in my absence, the whole tone of the letter seemed to me unnatural. The frantic wild beast of jealousy roared in his cage and wanted to break forth, but I was afraid of this beast, and I made haste to shut him up. What a vile feeling this jealousy is, I said to myself. What can be more natural than what she has written? And I lay on my bed and tried to think of the business which I should have to attend to the next day. I never go to sleep very quickly during these sessions in a new place, but this time I dropped asleep almost immediately. But as you know, it often happens, I suddenly felt something like an electric shock and started up, wide awake. As I woke with the thought of her, of my carnal love for her, and of Trukhachevsky, and how all that had been accomplished between him and her. Horror and rage crushed my heart, but I tried to reason myself out of it. "What rubbish!" I exclaimed. "There's not the slightest basis for any such suspicions. And how can I humiliate myself and her by harbouring such horrible thoughts? Here is someone in the nature of a hired fiddler with a reputation of being disreputable. And could a respectable woman, the mother of a family, my wife, suddenly fall a victim to such a man? What an absurdity!" That is what I argued on one side. But on the other came these thoughts. How could it fail to be so? Why is it not the simplest and most comprehensible thing? Was it not for that I married her? Was it not for that I lived with her? Was it not that which makes me necessary to her? And would not, therefore, another man, this musician, be likewise necessary to her? He is an unmarried man, healthy. I remember how lustily he crunched the gristle in the cutlet and put the glass of wine to his red lips. He's well fed, sleek, and not only without principles, but evidently guided by the theory that it is best to take advantage of whatever pleasures present themselves. And between them is the tie of music, the subtle lust of the senses. What can restrain him? She? Yes, but who is she? She is as much of a riddle as she has ever been. I don't know her. I know her only as an animal, and nothing can restrain an animal always likely to. Only at that instant I recalled their faces that evening after they had played the Kreutzer sonata, and while they were performing some passionate piece, I've forgotten what it was, something sentimental to the degree of obscenity. How could I have come away? I asked myself as I recalled their faces. Was it not perfectly evident that the fatal step was taken by them that evening? And was it not evident that even from that evening on, not only was there no bar between them, but that both of them, she especially, felt some sense of shame after what happened to them? I recalled with what a soft, pathetic, and blissful smile she wiped away the perspiration from her heated face as I approached the piano. Even then they avoided looking at each other, and only at dinner, when he poured her out some water, did they look at each other and timidly smile. I remember with horror that glance which I had intercepted, and that almost imperceptible smile. "Yes, the fatal step has been taken," said a voice within me, and instantly another voice seemed to say quite the contrary. "You are crazy. This cannot be," said the second voice. It was painful for me to lie there in the darkness. I lighted a match, and then it seemed to me terrible to be in that little room with its yellow wallpaper. I began to smoke a cigarette, and as is always the case when one turns round in the same circle of irresolvable contradictions, I smoked, and I smoked one cigarette after another for the purpose of befogging my mind and not seeing the contradictions. I did not sleep all night, and at 5 o'clock, having made up my mind that I could remain no longer in such a state of tension, but would instantly go back, I got up, wakened the bellboy who waited on me, and sent him after horses. I sent a note to the session stating that I had been called back to Moscow on extraordinary business, and therefore begged them to let another member take my place. At 8 o'clock, I took my seat in the tarantas and started. Chapter 25. The conductor came through the train, and noticing that our candle was almost burned out, extinguished it instead of putting in another. Out of doors, it was beginning to grow light. Porstenichev ceased speaking, and sighed heavily all the time the conductor was in the carriage. He proceeded with his story only when the conductor had taken his departure, and the only sound we could hear in the semi-darkness of the carriage was the rattle of the windows and regular snore of the merchant's clerk. In the twilight of the dawn, I could not make out Porstenichev's face at all. I could only hear his passionate voice growing ever more and more excited. I had to travel 35 versts by tarantas and 8 hours by rail. It was splendid travelling with horses. It was frosty and autumnal weather with a brilliant sun. You know that kind of weather when the tyres leave their print on the slippery road. The roads were smooth, the light was dazzling, and the atmosphere was exhilarating. Yes, it was jolly travelling by tarantas. As soon as it grew light and I was fairly on my way, my heart felt lighter. As I looked at the horses, at the fields, at the persons I met, I forgot what my errand was. It sometimes seemed to me that I was simply out for a drive, and that there was nothing whatever to stir me so, and I felt particularly happy at thus forgetting myself. If by chance it occurred to me where I was bound, I said to myself, "Wait and see what will be. Don't think about it now." About halfway, an event happened which delayed me, and still more tended to distract my attention. The tarantas broke down, and it was necessary to mend it. This breakdown had a great significance because it caused me to reach Moscow at midnight instead of at 5 o'clock as we had expected, and home at 1 o'clock, for I missed the express and was obliged to take a way train. The search for a cart, the mending of the tarantas, the settlement of the bill, tea at an inn, the conversation with the hostler, all this served to divert me more and more. By twilight everything was ready, and I was on my way once more. And during the evening it was still pleasanter travelling than by day. There was a young moon, a slight touch of frost, the roads were still excellent, and so were the horses. The postilion was jolly, and so I travelled on and enjoyed myself, scarce thinking at all of what was awaiting me. Or perhaps I enjoyed myself especially because I knew what was awaiting me, and I was having my last taste of the joys of life. But this calm state of mind, the power of controlling my feelings, came to an end as soon as I ceased travelling with the horses. As soon as I entered the railway carriage, an entirely different state of things began. This 8-hour journey by rail was something horrible to me, and I shall never forget it as long as I live. Either because, as soon as I entered the carriage, I vividly imagined myself as having already reached the end, or because railway travel has an exciting effect on people. As soon as I took my seat, I had no longer any control over my imagination, which ceaselessly, with extraordinary vividness, began to bring up before me pictures, kindling my jealousy. One after another they arose, and always to the same effect. What had taken place during my absence, and how she had deceived me. I was on fire with indignation, wrath, and a peculiar sense of frenzy caused by my humiliation as I contemplated these pictures, and I could not tear myself away from them, could not help gazing at them, could not rub them out, could not help evoking them. And then the more I contemplated these imaginary pictures, the more I was convinced of their reality. The vividness with which these pictures presented themselves before me seemed to serve as a proof of the actuality of what I imagined. A kind of a devil, perfectly against my will, suggested and stimulated the most horrible suggestions. A conversation I had once with Tolstoy's brother occurred to me, and with a sort of enthusiasm I lacerated my heart with this conversation, applying it to Tolstoy and my wife. It had taken place long before, but it came back clearly to me. I remember that once Tolstoy's brother, in reply to a question whether he ever went to certain houses, stated that no decent man would ever go to such places where there was danger of contracting disease, and that it was vile and disgusting. One could always find some society woman to serve his purpose. And now, here was his brother, and he had found my wife. To be sure, she is no longer young. She has a tooth missing on one side of her mouth. Her face is somewhat swollen, I said, trying to look from his standpoint. But what difference does that make? One must take what one can get. Yes, he's conferring a favour on her to take her as his mistress, said I to myself. Then, besides, there is no danger with her. No, it is impossible, I exclaimed in horror. There is no possibility of it, not the least, and there is not the slightest basis for any such conjectures. Has she not told me that to her it was a humiliating thought that I could be jealous of him? Yes, but she's a liar, always a liar, I would cry, and then began the same thing over again. There were only 2 passengers in my carriage, an old woman with her husband, both of them very silent, and they got out at the first stop, and I was left alone. I was like a wild beast in a cage. Now I would jump up and rush to the window, then staggering I would walk back and forth through the aisle, trying to make the train go faster. But the carriage, with all its seats and its window panes, shook just exactly as ours is doing now. And Postadnirchev sprang to his feet and took a few steps and then sat down again. Oh, I dread these railway carriages. They fill me with horror. Yes, I dread them awfully, he went on saying. I said to myself, I must think of something else. All right, let me think of the landlord of the inn where I took tea. Well, then before me would arise the long-bearded innkeeper and his grandson, a boy about as old as my Vasha. My Vasha! He will see a musician kissing his mother. What will happen to his poor soul at the sight? And what will she care? She is in love. And again would arise the same visions. No. Well, I will think about the inspection of the hospital. Yesterday that sick man complained of the doctor, a doctor with moustaches just like Tolstoy's, and how brazenly they both deceived me when he said that he was going away. And again it would begin. Everything I thought of had some connection with them. I suffered awfully. My chief suffering lay in my ignorance, in the uncertainty of it all, in my question whether I ought to love her or hate her. These sufferings were so intense that I remember the temptation came into my mind with great fascination to go out on the track and throw myself under the train on the rails, and so end it. Then at least there would be no further doubt. The one thing that prevented me from doing so was my self-pity, which was the immediate source of my hatred of her. Toward him also I had strange feeling of hatred and a consciousness of my humiliation and of his victory, but toward her my hatred was awful. It is impossible to put an end to myself and to leave her behind. I must do something to make her suffer, so that she may appreciate that I have suffered, I said to myself. I got out at all the stations in order to divert my mind. At one station I noticed that people were drinking in the buffet, and I immediately fortified myself with vodka. Next to me stood a Jew, and he also was drinking. He spoke to me, and that I might not be alone in my carriage, I went with him into his third-class compartment, though it was filthy and full of smoke and littered with the husks of seeds. There I sat down next to him, and he went on chatting and relating anecdotes. I listened to him, but did not take in what he said because I kept thinking of my own affairs. He noticed this and tried to attract my attention. Then I got up and went back to my own carriage. I must think it all over again, I said to myself, whether what I think is true and whether there is any foundation for my anguish. I sat down, desiring calmly to think it over, but instantly, in place of calm deliberation, the same tumult of thought began, in place of argument, pictures and figments of the imagination. How often have I not tortured myself so? I said to myself, for I remembered similar paroxysms of jealousy in times gone by, and then there was no ground for them, and so now, possibly, nay, probably, I shall find her calmly sleeping. She will wake up and be glad to see me, and I shall be conscious both in her words and in her looks that nothing has taken place, and that my suspicions were groundless. Oh, how delightful that would be! But no, this has been so too frequently, and now it will be so no longer, said some inner voice, and once more it will begin anew. Oh, what a punishment was here! I shall not take a young man through a syphilitic hospital to cure him of his passion for women, but into my own soul and give him a glimpse of the fiends that were rending it. You see, it was horrible that I claimed an undoubted absolute right to her body, just as if it had been my own body, and at the same time I was conscious that I could not control that body of hers, that it was not mine, and that she had the power to dispose of it as she chose, and that she did not choose to dispose of it as I wished. I could not even do anything to her or to him. He, like Wunker the cellarer before he was hanged, will sing a song of how he had kissed her on her sugary lips and the like. He would have the best of me, and with her I could do even less. If she had not yet done anything out of the way, but had it in her mind to, and I know that she did, the case is still worse. It would be better to have it done with, and so that I might know, and so as to have this uncertainty settled. I could not tell what I desired. I desired her not to want what she could not help wanting. This was absolute madness. Chapter 26. At the next to the last station, when the conductor came along to take the tickets, I picked up my belongings and went out on the platform, and the consciousness of what was about to take place still further increased my agitation. I became cold, and my jaws trembled so that my teeth chattered. Mechanically I followed the crowd out of the station, engaged a cab driver, and took my seat in his cab and drove away. As I drove along, glancing at the occasional pedestrians, at the dvorniks, and the shadows cast by the street lamps, and my cab, now in front and now behind, my mind seemed to be a blank. By the time we had driven half a verst from the station, my feet became cold, and I remembered that I had removed my woolen stockings in the train and put them into my bag. Where is my bag? Have I brought it with me? Yes, I had. But where is my wicker trunk? Then I remembered that I had entirely forgotten about my baggage. But while I was thinking about it, I found my receipt and decided that it was not worth while to return for it. And so I drove home. In spite of my endeavours, I can never remember to this day what my state of mind was at that time. What I thought, what I desired, I cannot tell. I only remember that I was conscious that something terrible and very vital in my life was in preparation. Whether this important event proceeded from the fact that I thought so, or because I foreboded it, I do not know. Perhaps after what happened subsequently, all the preceding moments have taken on a gloomy shade in my recollection. I reached the doorstep. It was 1 o'clock. Several cab drivers were standing in front of the door, waiting for fares in the light cast by the windows. The lighted windows were in our apartment, in the hall and the drawing-room. I made no attempt to explain to myself why our windows were still lighted so late at night, but still expectant of something dreadful about to happen, I mounted the steps and rang the bell. Yegor, the lackey, a good-natured, zealous but extremely stupid fellow, answered it. The first thing that struck my eyes in the vestibule was a cloak hanging on a peg with other outside garments. I ought to have been surprised, but I was not, because it was what I expected. It is true, I said to myself. When I asked Yegor who was there, and he mentioned Trukhachevsky, I asked, "Is there anyone else with them?" And he said, "No one." I remember that in his reply there was an intonation as if he felt he was giving me a pleasure in dispelling my apprehension that anyone else was there. "It is true. It is true," I seemed to say to myself. "But the children, thank God they are well. They've been asleep for a long time." I could not breathe freely, nor could I prevent the trembling of my lower jaw. Yes, of course, it is not as I thought it might be. Whereas formerly I imagined some misfortune, and yet found everything all right. As usual, now it was not usual. Now it was altogether what I had imagined and fancied that I only imagined, but it was now real. It was all— I almost began to sob, but instantly a fiend suggested, "Shed tears, be sentimental, but they will calmly separate. There will be no proof, and you will forever be in doubt and torment." Thereupon my self-pity vanished, and in its place came a strange feeling of gladness that my torture was now at an end, that I could punish her, could get rid of her, that I could give free course to my wrath. And I gave free course to my wrath. I became a wild beast, fierce and sly. No matter, I said to Yegor, who was about to go to the drawing-room. "Attend to this instead. Take a cab and go as quickly as you can to the station for my luggage. Here is the receipt. Off with you." He went into the corridor to get his paletoe. Fearing that he might disturb them, I accompanied him to his little room, and waited till he had got his things on. In the drawing-room, just through the wall, I could hear the sound of voices, and the clatter of knives and dishes. They were eating, and had not heard the bell. If only no one leaves the room now, I said to myself. Yegor put on his paletoe, trimmed with astrakhan wool, and started. I let him out and shut the door behind him, and I felt a sense of dread at the idea of being left alone, of having to act instantly. How? I did not know as yet. All I knew was that all was ended, that there could be no longer any doubt as to her guilt, and that I should presently punish her and put an end to my relations with her. Hitherto I had been troubled with vacillation, and had said to myself, "Maybe it's not so, maybe you're mistaken." Now this was at an end. Everything was now irrevocably decided, clandestinely, alone with him, at night. This proved perfect forgetfulness of everything, or something even worse. Such audacity, such insolence in crime was deliberately adopted in order that its very insolence might serve as a proof of innocence. All was clear, there could be no doubt. I was afraid of only one thing, that they might escape, might invent some new deception and deprive me of manifest proof and the possibility of convincing myself. And so as to catch them as promptly as possible, I went not through the drawing-room, but through the corridor and the nursery on my tiptoes, into the hall where they were sitting. In the first nursery-room the boys were sound asleep. In the second nursery-room the nurse stirred and was on the point of waking up, and I imagined to myself what she would think if she knew it all. And then such a sense of self-pity came over me at this thought that I could not restrain my tears. And in order not to wake the children, I ran out, on my tiptoes, into the corridor and into my own room, flung myself down on my divan and sobbed. I, an upright man, I, the son of my own parents, I who have dreamed all my life of the happiness of family life, I, a husband who have never been unfaithful to my wife. And here's she, the mother of 5 children, and she is embracing a musician because he has red lips. No, she is not human. She is a bitch, a vile bitch, next to the room where sleep her children, for whom all her life she has pretended to feel affection. And to write to me what she wrote, and so insolently to throw herself into his arms. And how do I know? Perhaps this same sort of thing has been taking place all the time. Who knows but the children, whom I have always supposed to be mine, may not have some lackey for their father? And if I had come home tomorrow, she would have met me with her hair becomingly done up, and her graceful, indolent movements. All the time I seemed to see her fascinating, abhorrent face. And this wild beast of jealousy would have taken his position for ever in my heart, and torn it. What will the nurse think? And Yegor, and poor Lishkotska? She already has her suspicions, and this brazen impudence, and this falsehood, and this animal sensuality which I know so well, I said to myself. I tried to get up, but could not. My heart throbbed so that I could not stand on my legs. Yes, I shall die of a stroke. She will have killed me. That is just what she wants. What would it be to her to kill me? Indeed, it would be quite too advantageous, and I will not bestow that gratification on her. Yes, here I am sitting, and yonder they are eating and talking together, and yes, in spite of the fact that she is no longer in her first youth, he will not despise her. Still, she's not bad-looking, and what is the main thing? At least she is not dangerous for his precious health. Why then have I not strangled her already? I asked myself, recalling the moment a week before when I drove her out of my library, and then smashed things. I had a vivid remembrance of the state of mind in which I was then, and not only had the remembrance, but I was conscious of the same necessity of striking, of destroying, as I had been conscious of before. I remember how I wanted to do something, and how all considerations except those that were necessary for action vanished from my mind. I came into the state of a wild animal, or rather of a man under the influence of physical excitement in time of danger, when he acts definitely, deliberately, but without losing a single instant, and all the time with a single object in view. Chapter 27. The first thing I did was to take off my boots, and then, in my stocking feet, I went to the wall, where various weapons and daggers were hung up over the divan, and I took down a curved Damascus dagger which had never been used and was very keen. I drew it out of its sheath. I remember the sheath slipped down behind the divan, and I remember I said to myself, I must find it afterwards, or else it will get lost. Then I took off my pale-toe, which I had all the time been wearing, and gliding along in my stockings, I went there, and stepping up stealthily, I suddenly threw open the door. I remember the expression of both of their faces. I remember that expression because it afforded me a tormenting pleasure. It was an expression of horror. That was the very thing I needed. I shall never forget the expression of despairing horror which came into their faces the first second when they saw me. He was seated, it seems, at the table, but when he saw me or heard me, he leapt to his feet and stood with his back against the sideboard. His face bore the one unmistakable expression of horror. On her face also was an expression of horror, but there was something else blended with it. If it had not been for that something else, maybe what happened would not have happened. But in the expression of her face there was, or so there seemed to me at the first instant, a look of disappointment, of annoyance that her pleasure in his love and her enjoyment with him were interrupted. It was as if she desired nothing else than to be left undisturbed in her present happiness. This expression and the other lingered but an instant on their faces. The expression of horror on his face instantly grew into a look which asked the question, is it possible to lie out of it or not? If it is possible, now is the time to begin. If not, then something else must be done, but what? He looked questioningly at her. On her face the expression of annoyance and disappointment changed, as it seemed to me when she looked at him, into one of solicitude for him. I stood for an instant on the threshold, holding the dagger behind my back. During that second he smiled, and in a voice so indifferent that it was ludicrous, he began, "We have been having some music." "Why, I was not expecting you," she began at the same instant, adopting his tone. But neither he nor she finished their sentences. The very same madness which I had experienced a week before took possession of me. Once more I felt the necessity of destroying something, of using violence. Once more I felt a transport of madness, and I yielded to it. Neither finished what they were saying. The something else which he was afraid of began, and it swept away instantaneously all that they had to say. I threw myself on her, still concealing the dagger in order that he might not prevent me from striking her in the side under the breast. I had chosen the spot at the very beginning. The instant I threw myself on her, he saw my design, and with an action which I never expected from him, he seized me by the arm and cried, "Think what you— Help!" I wrenched away my arm, and without saying a word rushed at him. His eyes met mine. He suddenly turned as pale as a sheet. Even to the lips his eyes glittered with a peculiar light. And most unexpectedly to me, he slipped under the piano and darted out of the door. I was just starting to rush after him when I was detained by a weight on my left arm. It was she. I tried to break away. She clung all the more heavily to my arm and would not let me go. This unexpected hindrance, the weight of her and her touch, which was repulsive to me, still further inflamed my anger. I was conscious of being in a perfect frenzy, and that I ought to be terrible, and I exulted in it. I drew back my left arm with all my might and struck her full in the face with my elbow. She screamed and let go my arm. I started to chase him, but remembered that it would be ridiculous for a man to chase his wife's lover in his stockings. And I did not want to be ridiculous, but I desired to be terrible. Notwithstanding the terrible frenzy in which I found myself, I never for an instant forgot the impression which I might produce on others, and this impression, even to a certain degree, governed me. I came back to her. She had fallen on a couch, and with her hand held up to her eyes, which I had bruised, was looking at me. In her face was such terror and hatred of me. Her enemy, as a rat might show when the trap in which it had been caught was held up. At all events, I could see nothing else in her face except terror and hatred of me. It was precisely the same terror and hatred which love to another would naturally evoke. But possibly I should have restrained myself and not done what I did if she had held her tongue. But suddenly she began to speak, and she seized my hand which held the dagger. "Come to your senses. What are you going to do? What is the matter with you? There has been nothing, no harm. I swear it." I should have still delayed, but these last words, from which I drew exactly the opposite conclusion, that is, that my worst fears were realized, required an answer. And the answer had to correspond with the mood to which I had wrought myself up, which had gone on in a crescendo and was bound to reach its climax. Madness also has its laws. "Do not lie, you wretch!" I cried, and with my left hand I seized her by the arm, but she tore herself away. Then, still clutching the dagger, I grasped her by the throat, pressed her over backward, and began to strangle her. What a muscular throat she had! She grasped my hands with both hers, tearing them away from her throat, and I, as if I had been waiting for this opportunity, struck her with the dagger into the side under the ribs. When men say that in an attack of madness they don't remember what they did, it's all false, all nonsense. I remember every detail, and not for 1 second did I fail to remember. The more violently I kindled within me the flames of my madness, the more brightly burned the light of consciousness, so that I could not fail to see all that I did. I knew every second what I was doing. I cannot say that I knew in advance what I was going to do, but at the instant I did anything, and perhaps a little before I knew what I was up to, as if for the purpose of being able to repent, in order that I might say to myself, I might have stopped. I knew that I struck below the ribs, and that the dagger would penetrate. At the moment I was doing this, I knew that I was doing something awful, something which I had never done before, and which would have awful consequences. But this consciousness flashed through my mind like lightning, and was instantly followed by the deed. The deed made itself conscious with unexampled clearness. I felt and I remember the momentary resistance of her corset, and of something else, and then sinking of the blade into the soft parts of her body. She seized the dagger with her hands, wounding them, but she did not stop me. Afterward, in the prison, while a moral revolution was working itself out in me, I thought much about that moment, what I might have done, and I thought it all over. I remembered that a second, only a second, before the deed was accomplished, I had the terrible consciousness that I was killing, and had killed, a woman, a defenseless woman, my wife. I recall the horror of this consciousness, and therefore I conclude, and indeed I dimly remember, that having plunged the dagger in, I immediately withdrew it, with the desire to remedy what I had done, and to put a stop to it. I stood for a second motionless, waiting to see what would happen, and whether I might undo what I had done. She sprang to her feet, and shrieked, "Nurse, he has killed me!" The nurse had heard the disturbance, and was already on the threshold. I was still standing, expectant and irresolute, but at that instant the blood gushed from under her corset. Then only I realized that it was impossible to remedy it. and I instantly concluded that it was not necessary, that I myself did not wish to have it remedied, and that I had done the very thing I was in duty bound to do. I lingered until she fell, and the nurse, with the exclamation, "Heavens!" rushed to her, and then I flung the dagger down and left the room. "I must not get excited. I must know what I'm doing," said I to myself, looking neither at her nor at the nurse. The nurse screamed and called to the maid. I went along the corridor, and stopping to send the maid, I went to my room. What must I do now? I asked myself, and instantly made up my mind. As soon as I reached my library, I went directly to the wall and took down a revolver and contemplated it. It was loaded, and I laid it on the table. Then I picked up the sheath from behind the divan, and finally I sat down on the divan. I sat long in that attitude. My mind was without a thought, without a recollection. I heard some commotion there. I heard someone arrive, and then someone else. Then I heard and saw Yegor bringing my luggage into my library, as if that would be useful to anyone now. "Have you heard what has happened?" I asked. "Tell the porter to inform the police." He said nothing, but went out. I got up, closed the door, got my cigarettes and matches, and began to smoke. I had not finished smoking my cigarette before drowsiness seized me and overcame me. I think I must have slept 2 hours. I remember I dreamed that she and I were friends, that we had quarrelled, but had made it up, and that some trifle stood in our way, but still we were friends. A knock on the door awakened me. "It is the police," I thought as I woke. "It seems I must have killed her. But maybe it is she herself, and nothing has happened." The knocking at the door was repeated. I did not answer, but kept trying to decide the question. Had all that really taken place, or not? Yes, it had. I remembered the resistance of the corset, and the sinking of the dagger, and a cold chill ran down my back. "Yes, it is true. Yes, now I must have my turn," said I to myself. But though I said this, I knew I should not kill myself. Nevertheless, I got up, and once more took the revolver into my hand. But strange as it may seem, I remember how many times before I had been near suicide, as for instance that very day on the railway train, and it seemed to me very easy for the very reason that I thought that by that means I could fill her with consternation. Now, I could not kill myself, or think of such a thing. Why should I do it? I asked myself, and there was no answer. The knocking still continued at the door. Yes, first I must find out who is knocking. I shall have time enough afterward. I laid the revolver down and covered it with a newspaper. Then I went to the door and drew back the bolt. It was my wife's sister, a worthy but stupid widow. "Vasha, what does this mean?" she asked, and her ever-ready tears began to gush forth. "What do you want?" I asked harshly. I saw that this was entirely unnecessary, and that I had no reason to be gruff with her, but I could not adopt any other tone. "Vasha, she is dying. Ivan Sakharich says so." Ivan Sakharich was her doctor, her adviser. "Why is he here?" I asked, and all my rage against her flamed up once more. "Well, suppose she is." "Vasha, go to her. Oh, how horrible this is!" she exclaimed. Must I go to her? Was the question that arose in my mind, and I instantly decided that I must go, that probably when a husband had killed his wife, as I had, he must always go to her, that it was the proper thing to do. "If it is always done, then I must surely go," I said to myself. "Yes, if it is necessary to, I shall. I can still kill myself," I reasoned in regard to my intention of blowing my brains out, and I followed her. "Now there will be phrases and grimaces, but I will not let them affect me," said I to myself. "Wait," said I to my sister. "It is stupid to go without my boots. Let me at least put on my slippers." Chapter 28. Another remarkable thing. Once more, as I left my room and went through the familiar rooms, once more arose the hope that nothing had taken place. But the odour of the vile medical appliances, iodoform, the carbolic acid, struck my senses. Yes, all was a reality. As I went through the corridor, past the nursery, I caught sight of Lizanka. She looked at me with frightened eyes. It seemed to me then that all 5 of the children were there, and that all of them were looking at me. I went to the door, and the chambermaid opened it from the inside and passed out. The first thing that struck my eyes was her light grey gown lying on a chair, and all discoloured with blood. She was lying on our double bed, on my own side of it, for it was easier of access on that side, and her knees were raised. She was placed in a very sloping position on pillows alone, with her bed jacket unbuttoned. Something had been placed over the wound. The room was full of the oppressive odour of iodoform. I was more than all struck by her swollen face, black and blue, part of her nose and under her eyes. It was the effect of the blow that I had given her with my elbow when she was trying to hold me back. Her beauty had all vanished, and her appearance was decidedly repulsive to me. I paused on the threshold. "Go to her, go," said her sister. "Yes, she probably wants to confess to me," I thought. Shall I forgive her? Yes, she's dying, and it is permissible to forgive her, I said mentally, striving to be magnanimous. I went close to her. She with difficulty raised her eyes to me. One of them was blackened, and she said with difficulty, with pauses between the words, "You have had your way. You have killed me." And in her face, through her physical suffering, and even the proximity of death, could be seen the old expression of cold animal hatred which I knew so well. "The children, anyway, you shall not have. She," indicating her sister, "will take them." As to what was the principal thing for me, her guilt, her unfaithfulness, she did not consider it worth while to say a word. "Yes, delight yourself in what you have done," said she, glancing at the door and sobbing. On the threshold stood her sister with the children. "Oh, what have you done?" I looked at the children, at her bruised and discoloured face, and for the first time forgot myself, my rights, my pride, for the first time recognized the human being in her. And so petty seemed all that had offended me, all my jealousy, and so significant the deed that I had done, that I had the impulse to bow down to her hand and to say, "Forgive me." But I had not the courage. She remained silent, closing her eyes, evidently too weak to speak further. Then her mutilated face was distorted with a frown. She feebly pushed me away. "Why has all this taken place? Why?" "Forgive me," I cried. "Forgive? What nonsense! If only I had not to die," she cried, raising herself up, and her deliriously flashing eyes were fastened on me. "Yes, you have wreaked your will. I hate you. Oh!" she screamed, evidently out of her head, evidently afraid of something. "Shoot! I'm not afraid. Only kill us all. He is gone. He is gone." The delirium continued to the very end. She did not recognize anyone. On the same day at noon, she died. Before that, at 8 o'clock in the morning, I was arrested and taken to prison, and there, while I was confined for 11 months, waiting for my trial, I had a chance to meditate on myself and my past life, and I came to understand it. On the third day I began to comprehend. On the third day they took me there." He wanted to say something more, but not having the strength to hold back his sobs, he paused. Collecting his strength, he continued. "I began to comprehend only when I beheld her in her coffin," he sobbed, but immediately continued hastily. "Only when I beheld her dead face did I understand what I had done. I comprehended that I had killed her, that it was through me that she, who had been living, moving, warm, was now motionless, wax-like and cold, and that there was no way of ever making it right. Never, never again. He who has not lived through this cannot comprehend." He cried several times and said no more. We sat a long time in silence. He sobbed and trembled before me. His face became pinched and long, and his mouth widened to its fullest extent. "Yes," he said suddenly, "if I had known what I know now, then everything would have been entirely different. I would not have married her I would not have married at all." Again we were long silent. "Well, goodbye, Prostitya." He turned from me and lay down on the seat, covering himself with his plaid. At the station where I was to leave the train, it was 8 o'clock in the morning, I went up to him to bid him farewell. Either he was asleep or was pretending to be sleeping. He did not move. I touched his hand. He uncovered himself, and it was plain that he had not been asleep. "Prashchatya, farewell," said I, offering him my hand. He took it and almost smiled, but so piteously that I felt like weeping. "Yes, goodbye, Prostitya," said he, repeating the very word with which he had closed his tale. This concludes the reading of the Kreutzer sonata by Leo Tolstoy, originally published in 1889. This anonymous translation first appeared in 1899. This book was read by Simon Preble. This unabridged recording was produced in 2012 by Blackstone Audio Inc., which holds the copyright. Neither this recording nor any portion of it may be reproduced or used for any purpose without prior written authorization from Blackstone Audio Inc. If you would like to obtain a monthly update telling you about new releases, call 1-800-SAY-BOOK. That's 1-800-729-2665. For a complete listing of our titles, visit our website at www.blackstoneaudio.com. Thank you.